A devoted wife, a respected pharmacist, and a cunning fraudster. How did Natalie Cochran's insatiable greed culminate in cold-blooded murder? On the surface, she was the picture of success, an intelligent businesswoman, a trusted member of her community. But beneath the facade lurked a tangled web of deception, financial fraud, and a desperate bid to cover her tracks. When Michael Cochran, a 38-year-old military veteran, suddenly collapsed and died in 2019, no one suspected foul play. But as investigators peeled back the layers of his wife's double life, a chilling truth emerged. What dark secrets led to Michael's untimely death? And how far would Natalie go to keep her lies from unraveling? Welcome to Timeless Crime, where we uncover the most haunting and perplexing cases of our time. Before we continue this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support helps us bring you in-depth coverage of the most compelling true crime cases. Natalie Cochran was, by all appearances, a woman who had it all. A respected pharmacist in Beckley, West Virginia, she built a reputation as a hard-working professional, a devoted wife, and an ambitious entrepreneur. Her husband, Michael Cochran, was a military veteran, a man known for his kindness, discipline, and unwavering commitment to his family. Together, they seemed to live a comfortable life in the quiet town, far from the chaos of major cities. But behind the carefully constructed image of success lay a far darker reality. Natalie was leading a double life, one built on deception, financial fraud, and an insatiable hunger for wealth. While she outwardly maintained the role of a loving wife and successful businesswoman, she was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that would eventually unravel in the most sinister way possible. In early 2019, tragedy struck when Michael Cochran suddenly fell ill and died. His passing was initially attributed to natural causes, a tragic but unremarkable event, until investigators took a closer look. What they found was a web of financial crimes, betrayal, and a chilling method of murder that left an entire community in shock. This is the story of how one woman's greed led to a calculated crime, the methodical elimination of her husband, and a legal battle that exposed the depth of her deception. A journey through fraudulent schemes, a mysterious death, and the unraveling of a cold-blooded killer. Before the headlines, before the courtroom drama, and before the shocking murder that left a community reeling, there was Natalie Cochran, the ambitious pharmacist, the aspiring businesswoman, and, ultimately, the architect of an intricate financial deception. Natalie Cochran's story began in West Virginia, where she built a career rooted in science and medicine. As a licensed pharmacist, she was trusted to safeguard people's health, a role that carried great responsibility. But for Natalie, dispensing medication and filling prescriptions wasn't enough. She had bigger dreams, dreams of financial independence, of power, of wealth beyond what a pharmacist's salary could provide. Her ambition led her to venture into business, and soon, she established two companies, Technology Management Solutions, TMS, and Tactical Solutions Group, TSG. On paper, these companies were positioned as government contractors, businesses poised to secure lucrative deals with federal agencies. It was a convincing front, one that gave Natalie the appearance of a savvy entrepreneur navigating the high-stakes world of defense contracting. But beneath the surface, something wasn't right. The contracts never materialized, the revenue never matched the expectations, and the businesses, despite their impressive names, were little more than a facade. Michael Cochran, her husband, was a military veteran, a man accustomed to structure, discipline, and honesty. He had served his country, and after leaving the military, he settled into a quiet life with Natalie. By all accounts, he was devoted to his wife, trusting her intelligence and business acumen. He worked hard, believing that their shared future was secure, that Natalie's ventures would bring them prosperity. Yet, unbeknownst to Michael, the financial foundation of their life was crumbling. Natalie's businesses were failing, and the promises she made to investors were built on lies. Instead of landing real government contracts, she turned to deception, creating the illusion of success to lure in unsuspecting victims. Investors were told their money would be used to fund major defense projects, but in reality, it was being funneled into Natalie's personal expenses and used to repay earlier investors, a classic Ponzi scheme. Over time, the lies stacked up. Nearly $2 million had been taken from investors, and Natalie was running out of ways to keep the illusion alive. The walls were closing in. As financial pressures mounted, so too did the risk of exposure. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just mean financial ruin, it could mean prison. And then, in early 2019, Michael Cochran died. A sudden and unexplained death that, at first, seemed like a tragic misfortune. But in hindsight, it was something far more sinister, a desperate act, a calculated move to silence the one person who might uncover the truth. The question now was, did Natalie see Michael as a loving husband, or as an obstacle standing in the way of her empire of lies? By early 2019, Natalie Cochran was running out of time. Her financial empire, built on deception, fraud, and stolen investments, was on the brink of collapse. The lies that had sustained her lavish lifestyle were beginning to unravel, and with every passing day, the risk of exposure grew. Investors were expecting returns, money she didn't have. The walls were closing in. And then, Michael Cochran, the man who had trusted her the most, became a problem she could no longer ignore. Michael was a military veteran, a man of discipline and integrity. But what he didn't know was that his wife's businesses were nothing more than a house of cards. Whether Michael had started to suspect something or whether Natalie feared that he eventually would, one thing became clear: he was in the way. If he uncovered the truth, everything would come crashing down: her reputation, her businesses, her freedom. So, Natalie made a choice. A calculated, cold-blooded decision. In early February 2019 it started like any other night in their home in Beckley, West Virginia. There was no fight, no dramatic confrontation. If Michael had any suspicions about his wife's financial dealings, he hadn't voiced them. He had no reason to believe that this night would be his last. But Natalie knew. Sometime during the evening, she administered a fatal dose of insulin, a drug that, in normal circumstances, is life-saving for diabetics. But Michael wasn't diabetic. His body had no need for insulin, no natural way to counteract its effects. In the wrong hands, insulin becomes a silent killer, one that can cause a slow, undetectable death, mimicking natural causes. As the drug entered his system, Michael's blood sugar plummeted. The effects weren't immediate, but they were relentless. He would have begun feeling weak and dizzy, perhaps blaming it on exhaustion or dehydration. Then, confusion would have set in, his mind clouding as his body struggled to compensate for the unnatural drop in glucose levels. At some point, he collapsed. His body, unable to regulate itself, was shutting down. Seizures. Shallow breathing. His heartbeat is growing weaker by the minute. Natalie was there. She saw him in distress. And she made her second choice that night. She did nothing. Instead of calling for help, instead of rushing him to the hospital, she let him sleep it off. A decision that ensured there would be no intervention, no chance for survival. A decision that sealed his fate. In the hours that followed, Michael never woke up. His body succumbed to the effects of the insulin overdose, his brain deprived of the glucose it needed to function. When emergency responders finally arrived, it was too late. At first glance, his death seemed unremarkable, a tragic, unexplained medical event. There were no immediate signs of foul play, no struggle, and no apparent reason for suspicion. A healthy man, suddenly gone. Natalie played the role of the grieving widow with precision. She had an explanation for everything. Michael hadn't been feeling well. He had gone to bed early. It was unexpected, yes, but not entirely shocking. People died in their sleep all the time, didn't they? For a while, it seemed like her plan had worked. There was no autopsy, no deeper investigation. The case was quietly closed. Michael was buried, and Natalie was free to continue her life. Free to collect sympathy, free to carry on with her fraudulent schemes, free to believe that she had gotten away with murder. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface. And soon, the carefully constructed narrative that Natalie Cochran had built was about to come crashing down. 4 months after Michael Cochran's death, Natalie Cochran walked free. No handcuffs. No interrogation. No suspicion. She played the grieving widow, the woman who had lost her beloved husband too soon. She carried on with her life as if nothing had happened. And for a while, nothing did. Michael's death had been ruled as natural causes. No foul play is suspected. No deeper questions were asked. But the truth has a way of creeping into the light. And when it did, it came not from whispers of murder but from the unraveling of Natalie's financial empire. Long before law enforcement questioned Natalie about her husband's death, they were investigating something else: her businesses. Technology Management Solutions. Tactical Solutions Group. These companies, which Natalie had once boasted as successful government contractors, were now under scrutiny. Investors were coming forward, angry, betrayed, demanding answers. The numbers didn't add up. Millions of dollars had been funneled into Natalie's ventures. Promises of lucrative defense contracts had lured in eager investors. But those contracts? They never existed. Instead, the money had been used to fund Natalie's lavish lifestyle, to repay earlier investors in a desperate attempt to keep the illusion alive, a classic Ponzi scheme. Federal agents started digging deeper, tracing the money trail, following the lies. And the deeper they dug, the more they found. In 2021, Natalie was arrested for wire fraud and money laundering. The empire she had built on deception was crumbling. But there was something else. Something far more chilling. A question that no one had dared to ask before. What really happened to Michael Cochran? By this point, Michael had been gone for over 2 years. His case had been closed. His body was buried. But now, investigators had reason to look again. The timing of his death, so eerily aligned with Natalie's financial troubles, was too coincidental to ignore. They started asking questions. Why had Michael, a healthy 38-year-old, died so suddenly? Why had there been no autopsy? Why had Natalie been so quick to accept the ruling of natural causes? One by one, the red flags began to appear. And soon, there was only one way to get the answers they needed. Michael's body was exhumed. And what they found changed everything. In the controlled, sterile environment of a forensic lab, Michael's remains were examined with fresh eyes. New tests, new techniques, far more advanced than what had been available at the time of his death. Scientists and medical examiners pored over every detail, searching for clues his body still held. And then, they found it. Insulin. More specifically, non-prescribed insulin. Michael Cochran had never been diabetic. He had no history of insulin use, no medical condition that required it. And yet, his body contained evidence of an insulin overdose, a dose that had sent his blood sugar plummeting, triggering seizures, brain damage, and ultimately, death. Suddenly, his death was no longer a mystery. It was a murder. And there was only one person who had both the knowledge and the motive to commit it. Natalie Cochran. Even with this breakthrough, proving murder wouldn't be easy. Insulin poisoning is a silent killer. It leaves no obvious wounds, no visible trauma. Without the advanced forensic testing conducted during the exhumation, Michael's death could have easily remained undetected forever. And then there was the timeline. By the time investigators had their smoking gun, years had passed. Evidence had faded. Witness memories had grown hazy. And Natalie? She had built a fortress of lies around herself. But law enforcement had something even stronger than physical evidence, a motive. Investigators began piecing together Natalie's true financial state at the time of Michael's death. By early 2019, her Ponzi scheme was failing. Investors were pressuring her for returns she couldn't deliver. Money was vanishing faster than she could replace it. And Michael? Michael was the one person close enough to see the cracks. Had he begun to suspect? Had he asked too many questions? Or was he simply an inconvenience, a loose end that needed to be tied up before he could ever find out the truth? What investigators knew for certain was this: Michael's death benefited Natalie. Not just emotionally, allowing her to play the role of the grieving widow, deflecting suspicion, but financially, with Michael gone, she was able to continue her fraudulent schemes unchecked. The evidence was mounting. The motive was clear. And the facade that Natalie had so carefully crafted was beginning to shatter. The woman who had built her life on deception was about to face the ultimate reckoning. Natalie Cochran had spent years weaving a web of deception, convincing investors, friends, and even her own husband that she was a successful entrepreneur. But by the time investigators pieced together the truth, the financial fraud, the insulin overdose, the cold-blooded murder, there was nowhere left to hide. And soon, the woman who once controlled millions of stolen dollars found herself standing before a judge, facing justice. At first, Natalie's legal troubles revolved solely around fraud. In 2021, she was indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud and money laundering. Prosecutors accused her of orchestrating a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors out of nearly $2 million. Her conviction on those charges was swift. In federal court, she pleaded guilty, receiving a lengthy prison sentence for financial crimes. But investigators weren't done with her yet. Because by then, they had already reopened the case of Michael Cochran's death. And when forensic testing revealed that insulin poisoning had killed him, Natalie was indicted again, this time, for first-degree murder. When Natalie Cochran stepped into a West Virginia courtroom to stand trial for Michael's murder, she was no longer a respected pharmacist. No longer a savvy businesswoman. She was a fraudster. A con artist. And now, an accused murderer. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted Natalie as a woman drowning in lies, a woman whose empire of deception was on the verge of collapse. The evidence was damning. Michael's body contained non-prescribed insulin. A fatal dose that he never should have had. There was no medical reason for him to receive insulin. He wasn't diabetic, had never been prescribed it, and had no history of insulin use. Natalie, as a pharmacist, had access to insulin. She knew its effects, knew how to administer it, and knew how to make it look like a natural death. But the most powerful argument came down to motive. Prosecutors argued that Michael was a threat to Natalie's entire scheme. If he had uncovered the truth about her fraudulent businesses, it wouldn't just mean financial ruin, it could mean prison. The only way to stop him, to keep her secrets buried, was to eliminate him entirely. And that's exactly what she did. She injected her husband with insulin, let him suffer through a slow and agonizing death, and then did nothing. Number 911 call. No rush to the hospital. Just cold, calculated indifference. Natalie's defense team had an impossible task. The evidence of fraud was undeniable, the forensic proof of insulin poisoning was irrefutable. And the timeline, Michael's death occurring just as Natalie's financial empire was crumbling, was too suspicious to ignore. Still, they tried to cast doubt. They argued that Michael's death could have been a tragic accident. Maybe he had unknowingly come into contact with insulin. Maybe it was some unexplained medical condition. They questioned whether there was enough direct evidence to prove Natalie had actually administered the dose. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, just a series of damning circumstances. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen enough. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. But it didn't take long. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict was clear. Guilty. Natalie Cochran was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No early release. No second chances. The woman who had once lived a life of wealth and deception would now spend the rest of her days behind bars. The conviction sent shockwaves through West Virginia and beyond. The case wasn't just about fraud or murder, it was about the dangers of unchecked greed. Natalie Cochran had fooled investors, friends, even her own husband. She had built an illusion so convincing that no one questioned her until it was too late. News outlets covered the trial extensively, painting her as a modern-day Black Widow, a woman willing to sacrifice everything, even the man who loved her, to protect her empire of lies. For Michael's family and friends, the verdict brought closure, but not peace. They had spent years believing his death was a tragic accident, only to learn that the person closest to him had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. And for Natalie, the woman who once manipulated money, people, and reality itself, her days of deception were over. Because in a prison cell, surrounded by cold concrete walls, there is no more illusion. No more escape. No more lies. Just the weight of her crimes. And a lifetime to remember them. Natalie Cochran's story is one of unchecked ambition, greed, and betrayal. A woman who had everything, success, respect, a family, yet craved more. And in pursuit of that, she destroyed lives. Her Ponzi scheme wasn't just a financial crime, it was a masterclass in manipulation. She preyed on trust, exploiting investors who believed in her, weaving a facade so convincing that even her husband may not have realized the truth until it was too late. But greed alone doesn't explain murder. What makes someone cross that final line? Was it desperation, the fear of losing control, or simply a belief that she could outsmart everyone once again? This case also serves as a cautionary tale. Financial fraudsters thrive on trust, on the illusion of success. Investors, family, and even law enforcement missed the warning signs until it was too late. Could this have been prevented? Could someone have asked the right questions sooner? Ultimately, Natalie Cochran's story forces us to confront a chilling reality: how far will someone go to protect a lie? And more importantly, how can we recognize deception before it turns deadly? Natalie Cochran built a life on deception, until it all came crashing down. Fraud, betrayal, murder. How far will someone go to protect a lie? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next case. See you next time.